Hello, nurse scientist. So glad you are here for Unit 2 as we begin a deeper discovery of nursing research. And I wanted to just let you know that research is everywhere and it surrounds us, and you don't really have to look far to find some really cool things, like this research flash where there was a recent quantitative exploratory study that looked at the statin cholesterol lowering drugs applied in an ointment to wound healing. This was a very cool study that really looked at an experimental group that used cholesterol ointment on wounds versus a control group that only used petroleum jelly. And it was a double-blind study where neither the researcher nor the patients knew which ointment they were seeing. But you know what they found? The results indicated a dramatic increase in wound healing. Less time, less infection. Fabulous. So there you go. That's one of the most current studies to hit the press recently. And this leads us into a beautiful segue regarding ethics in research. Well, just so you know, horrible atrocities have been committed in the name of research, particularly during the World War II era, the 40s, the 30s, the 40s, and the 50s, really. The Nazis led the way in these atrocities. They were looking at research, for example, on how long does it take for frostbite to occur by leaving people out in the snow and the ice. And what were the signs and the symptoms that people demonstrated when they were submerged in ice water for 3 hours? So they were inducing hypothermia. People were dying. And that's just the tip of the iceberg. Just terrible, terrible atrocities. And also during this time, the Japanese researchers were doing some pretty horrific things. They were infecting women prisoners with syphilis and then having them be impregnated by the male prisoners, thereby spreading the syphilis. And then they dissected the live babies and mothers to see what the effects of the syphilis were on the baby and the mama. Wow. And then they drained the male prisoners' blood. They drained their blood and replaced it with horse blood. Well, they discovered that was a 100% mortality rate. So you see, things in the name of science were just horrible. And so, after these atrocities became made public, the world really rose up against it and said, this just can't continue. So the Nuremberg Code was developed around 1947 to establish some basic research criteria to apply to everybody. Doesn't matter what the country, what your background was, that really said you've got to inform the subjects of what the research is about. They've got to know. And they've got to be willing participants. And then the second point of the Nuremberg Code was that really most research must be first done on animals extensively before you even begin using humans. And that they finally, number 3, must be for the good of society. Not just because you're mildly curious about things, but that there has to be a end point of promise and potential. So that was the Nuremberg Code, and we've really, in the science world, tried to adhere to that. But even then, there have been studies, like the Tuskegee study, that have just been sad. Also, the Declaration of Helsinki was developed in 1964. And you know, this really hadn't been terribly long ago when you think about it. But this was adopted by the World Medical Association as a guide for MDs conducting research, along the similar lines to support the Nuremberg Code. The Belmont Report came out in 1979, and it was specifically for the protection of human subjects that goes into more detail about the informed consent and about the guarding of life and limb and property. So you see, we've got a wonderful code of ethics now, and there are systems and processes in place to ensure that research is conducted in the most ethical manner possible. So I want you to also look at page 83 through 86 in your text, because it does a fabulous job detailing the principles that guide our ethical research. Now, I'm pretty sure you also have to do a compliance with the CITI about the ethical issues, and so this may just be a refresher for you. And here are the major ethical principles that are brought forth in the Belmont Report. And the first is beneficence, and that is really to protect the subject from harm, protect from all harm, whether it's physical, emotional, social, or financial. And that research should not damage the people who are participating. And that there is respect for human dignity, all persons, that they have the opportunity for full disclosure and not deception about the research project. And certainly justice, that the subject should receive fair treatment. And we're going to talk about some of these things a little more in detail, because if someone refuses to participate in research, then they should have justice as well and equal treatment. They should not be denied treatment as a result of their declining to participate. And so justice comes into play there as well. The respect for human dignity. You'll see where they have the self-determination that can't be coerced, and again, that full disclosure that we talked about. I do want to point out that page 86, box 5.1 is key, because it talks about protecting subjects and how important that is to look at a risk-benefit ratio. Again, here's the justice principle, fair treatment, and the right to privacy, that confidentiality and anonymity. And we're going to talk more about that in just a moment. So the procedures for protecting study participants. That risk-benefit ratio is crucial, because the benefits of participation in a study really must outweigh the risk. And some of these risks include loss of confidentiality. Goodness, if you were asking a student group to answer questions regarding recreational drug use, you may be asking them to disclose things about themselves that could be harmful and come back to haunt them. Also, a loss of privacy. Let's say you're going to conduct a study about HIV diagnosis, and you're pulling together a focus group or a post-abortion grief focus group. Well, when these people show up, essentially they are losing that privacy or confidentiality, and you're letting the cat out of the bag. So that the risk of that versus the benefits really have to be weighed so that you do not cause harm. And informed consent. It really means that the participant has adequate information to understand, comprehend, and to choose to participate or not in the study. If there's a new drug out on the market, and goodness, they are coming out every week, the participant says no, they don't really want to participate in the new drug study, then they are still entitled to treatment according to the standard of care. And so that informed consent has to include that even if you refuse to participate here, we will continue to treat you. Also, debriefing and referrals are part of the post-research. You can't just screen and deal and do your study and then all of a sudden just say, okay, you're on your own. Let's say you found something about an HIV study. Well, then you as a researcher, it's an ethical thing to then provide debriefing and referrals for follow-up post the research. And then there's special treatment of vulnerable groups. And we're going to talk more about that, but people like prisoners and children are in that category. And then you're going to see the external review, the IRB, the Institutional Review Board. And these are big, fat, hairy deals because these are the governing, okaying, overseeing, oversight bodies of all research. UMMC has one for our entity. So if any research is conducted in our facility, it has to go through this IRB board, who are a panel of experts and give it rigor and close scrutiny and either say, yeah, you can do it, or no, you can't. And they look at things like full disclosure. We've talked about that. Versus deliberate deception. And for example, there was a study in 1963 conducted by a fellow by the name of Milgram. And he was conducting a study regarding the obedience to authority. Well, it was conducted in a laboratory setting and was described to the potential subjects as a learning experiment. That was all that was disclosed. Well, the subjects were told to deliver an electrical shock when this learner, who was an actor, gave an incorrect response to a question. Now the actors were out of sight, so the subject couldn't hear, or couldn't see, but they could hear. And so when the actor or the learner gave an incorrect response, the subject delivered an electrical shock and the actor screamed and groaned out loud. Well, this went on, and what they discovered was that 26% of these subjects continued to administer these shocks. However, there were physical and emotional responses of the subjects that were giving those shocks that included things like sweating, trembling, hyperventilating, stuttering, and even one had a seizure. So they were experiencing significant emotional, psychological harm. Not necessarily physical, but they were physical when they had the seizure, weren't they? So there was harm to the subject. And it is this kind of study that the IRB will stop, and nowadays they will prosecute, so it's not a good thing at all. Now, informed consent is extremely important. Page 87 of your text really goes into detail about that. But your subject has to be aware of all of these dynamics. And there's really a great example of the documentation of that informed consent in your textbook. And it's a formal document. It can be rescinded by the subject at any time. It may be at the end of the study. It may be after the study has concluded, so that you can't use their information, but that consent form is powerful and it's all inclusive. Now, there is a thing known as implied consent, and that's usually for questionnaires, and it may go something like, by completing this questionnaire, you agree to participate in the study. Some of you may have done those kinds of research studies. And then there is an oral permission that may also be obtained, but it must be witnessed by a third person. Now here's something important to know. A minor, or someone who was unable to give consent, somebody who's nonverbal or not cognitively aware, then you have to get consent from the guardian or, yes, the person who's legally responsible for that person. Confidentiality procedures. One of the things in research you really want to provide is anonymity. This is where even the researcher can't link like your answers to your questionnaire to you. So there's coding that may be used for subjects. Instead of identifying information like the 28-year-old female nurse that works CCU, there may be a code, it may be a number. So that really nobody knows who said what. And you want to provide for anonymity. But that is not always guaranteed, and I'll tell you an example. Let's say that you're conducting educational research, and we're wanting to know what you think about online RN to BSN programs. Well, when we talk about the setting for the study being the UMMC School of Nursing, you know, the jig is up there about who that might be, that you, as a student, probably participated in that study. So that anonymity thing, you really have to consider and look at protecting who that those subjects may be. Interesting stuff, isn't it? Also, the certificate of confidentiality. What we're saying here, and that is in the informed consent, is about what are you going to do with this information once you're done. And that you're not going to report that publicly in a way that identifies them. Like when we report a study, we're not going to say, well, this was conducted at the UMMC School of Nursing. We would report that as that this was conducted in a southern regional university setting so that it doesn't narrow it down. You also don't really want to, even though you're going to give demographics like age, race, employment, you're not going to just say, well, this was the RN to BSN group at UMMC and their love of research. Ah, there you go, confidentiality procedures, and they are very important, not only in your research, but you may see that again on a test. Treatment of vulnerable groups. Well, these are anybody who just requires special protections. Children certainly fall into this category, and the severely ill or physically disabled or mentally and emotionally disabled as well. And pregnant women are also higher than average risk because you're dealing with 2 humans as opposed to 1. So here are some things to consider. Children 7 years of age or older really need to be included in the informed consent procedures because they need to be able to give assent, A-S-S-E-N-T, or agreement to participate in the study. For example, immunization research. All these new immunizations that are coming out, if you're conducting research regarding that, then you need to have a discussion not only with the child's guardian, parent, whoever, but also the child, have their at least agreement. Certainly the mentally, emotionally disabled, you would have to have their legal guardian give consent. Anybody who's terminally ill. Institutionalized people, and this would include prisoners. You can't use prisoners just because they're a convenient sample. It has to have significant impact for that group, and they have a lot of special accommodations to be included in research. Now, the external review, we've kind of hit on the IRBs already, but this is the committee, and you'll need to know this, that ensures and reviews the research that these investigators are conducting the research ethically. And they look at all facets that protect subjects. And they really have an ongoing review responsibility as well, because they want to make sure that the end result is also meeting the standards of ethics. So that IRB is important. All right, so that's it for Chapter 5. Let's move on to Chapter 6 as we talk about some basic terminology about the blueprint for conducting research studies. And research problems, questions, and hypotheses. Oh my! Well, the research problem really comes from a concept or a broad issue that is important to nursing, such as acute pain, coping with illness, or health promotion. So your research problem is just going to be something that troubles you, and it probably doesn't take you long to think about some that you're facing in your clinical area. Well, when you come up with the problem, then you come up with a problem statement. And when you're looking and reading research, look for this problem statement because it should tell you, this is the argument for why This is the what will be examined in this study. It is the so what. It indicates the importance and the need for this research and what it may mean for patients, families, and communities. So look for these. Also, some other terminology you'll be finding in research is the statement of the purpose. And this really has to do with the overall study goal. What hope does the researcher have in obtaining information about this study? What will the research yield? And then you're going to see research aims or objectives. And these are going to be a part of answering the research questions or hypothesis. Research questions. These are the specific questions the researcher wants to know. For example, do gel pillows reduce bilateral head molding in preterm infants? If so, are they more effective than air mattresses or air pillows? If so, are they more effective than water-filled mattresses or pillows? See, those are very specific research questions. And when you get to the hypothesis, well, this is just the prediction about the relationships of the variables in the research. And these will be developed from that fabulous deductive reasoning that we use. Your hypothesis is a formal statement of the expected relationships between two or more variables in a specified population. A formal statement. Isn't that cool? So your research problems and questions, what should they look like? Well, they need to be broad enough to look at really the central concerns or issues and really identify the specific gaps in knowledge needed for the practice. Well, we simply don't know that gel pillows are better or worse. They've not been tested. So this will be filling that knowledge gap. See? Let's say those gel pillows for the very low birth weight preterm baby. Our problem statement may look something like, early studies indicate water or air-filled mattresses are effective to prevent that undesirable bilateral head molding. But there are 0 studies that measure the effectiveness of gel pillows, which is a newer product. Isn't that cool? You will also want to probably look at page 100 of your textbook because there are some examples there that really do a beautiful job of making the research problem and the questions broad enough but narrow enough to set up your study design. I also want you to really look at table 6.1, pages 100 through 106, because your text really does a superior job of helping you look at how do you write research questions. So look those over, and it will help you when you start to read and dissect your research studies what to look for, and does it make sense. And here's some examples here for quantitative studies, and here's some for qualitative studies about how to write that and what's included in those problem statements. Your hypothesis. Ah, yes. Now you may have several hypotheses in a study based on its complexity. Well, your hypothesis excuse me, influences the study design. It influences the sampling method, the data collection, the analysis, and the interpretation of those study findings. It really kind of sets the whole stage for your research project. But I want to point out that your hypothesis is a declarative statement. Remember, it's a prediction of relationships between two or more variables. And you will only find hypothesis in quantitative studies. Let me say that again. You will only find hypothesis in quantitative, that rigor control studies. Isn't that cool? All right, so Now, if you're conducting a quantitative study that only has one variable, then you may not have a hypothesis, because remember, a hypothesis is you're looking at a prediction between two or more variables. So if you only have one variable, then you won't have a hypothesis. Don't you love it? This is like a brain teaser. Huh? All right, so the prediction of relationships between two or more variables. Now, there are some things that the hypothesis contains, and remember, it influences the whole study design, the methods, the data collection, and the interpretation. And it contains some statistical values that give you the statistical significance of the findings. So, remember that hypotheses are quantitative. So, will you find a hypothesis in a qualitative research study? Will you? No. The answer is no, you will not. But you're going to find when you are using these in your quantitative studies or looking for them that you're going to be looking for the p-value. And this is where that p-value of statistical significance comes into play. All right, hang on to your hat because we're getting ready to discuss the types of hypotheses. There are the directional hypotheses and the non-directional hypotheses. When you're giving your prediction, you're looking at the direction of the relationship. So you're going to see terminology like lesser, greater, more than, less than. For example, children whose mothers participate in the nurse case management intervention regarding partner violence will show significantly less behavioral problems than children whose mothers receive screening in the information card only. So this directional hypothesis is saying that the intervention actually results in less behavioral disturbances or problems. That's an example of a directional hypothesis. Non-directional hypotheses, however, really predict the existence of a relationship and not necessarily its direction. Like, for example, there are differences between tap water, soap suds, and polyethylene glycol enema solutions in rectal output, irritation, and subject discomfort with enemas. So there is a relationship, but it's not giving you a direction, whether it's better, worse, more than, less than, etc. Don't you like how this works? Now here's one I really want you to hang your hat on, because there's research versus null hypothesis. And again, the research hypothesis is just looking at your actual prediction of the relationship, the expected relationship. For example, there's a correlation between the number of sources of stress reported by nurses working in the CCU environment and the nurse's desire to leave employment in that setting. So the more stressors the CCU nurse has, whether it be client load, turnover rate, staffing, whatever, the greater their desire to leave employment. So that might have impact in terms of what management might do. But that research hypothesis says that there is a relationship. Now here's one to hang your hat on, the null hypothesis. Because what we do in quantitative research is we test the null, and we test the null hypothesis with statistical measures. And we have a whole class on that later on. But it says that there is really no difference. There is an absence of a relationship. For example, there is no significant difference in the duration of patency of a 24-gauge IV heparin lot when flushed with 0.5 milliliters of heparin solution compared to a 0.9% normal saline. See? There is no difference. And so we test that in our statistical procedures so that we can see if it is valid or not. All right, so those are the types of hypotheses. There will be more to come on this later on, but just so you know, and let's refresh. The hypothesis is a feature of what type of research? Quantitative or qualitative? And your answer is quantitative. Very good. Good job. All right, as we're moving on then to Chapter 7 to talk about the literature review. I do want to just remind you that hypotheses or research or theory for that matter do not prove. We are suggesting relationships. Don't you like that? Cool stuff. All right, so why do we do literature reviews? Well, it is very important to know what is out there, what is known or not known about a subject or a issue or a topic. And the only way to do that is to dig in the literature to find it. So you really have to spend some time searching the literature because you need to know what is existing before you really set your study up. It helps you research, helps you shape your research questions and suggest really methods, and you might even find a study to replicate in your setting or with your subjects. So it's very important to know these things. The types of information you'll be looking for, primary resources are essential. That is the original study and is always preferred, and that's where you really want to go to first, because there's less reliance on those secondary sources. And those are, you include these in your research of the literature or your review of the literature, but this is really what others are saying about that original research. And it is somewhat lending of opinion, so you may use those, anecdotes, articles, case reports, but your hat will be hung for your literature research on your primary sources. Go straight to the horse's mouth. Now there are some wonderful electronic databases. You know, long gone are the days of spending hours in the library looking these things up because they're all electronic now. And our Roland Library can connect you really to all of these, and you probably have already done a great deal of this in your previous work in this program. Here are some key databases for nurse researchers. Just want to remind you, no Wikipedia, ever, ever, ever. That is not a reliable source. Best not to use Google or Yahoo either. However, Google Scholar may be a good place to start to give you other references to pursue. Because when you're using the bibliographic databases, you are increasing your efficiency and precision in getting to the meat of the data. So I encourage you to get on PubMed. And the other thing about these databases is, and CINAHL, they are all peer-reviewed, refereed journals. And if you remember what that means, they have met the measure of rigor to be published because they have been scrutinized by experts and are found to be valid. So, your book also does a fabulous job about detailing the search strategies, and I encourage you to read that section. Because when you sit down to write your literature review, and I know you will, I encourage you as you are researching things now, start maintaining your electronic file or either a hard copy file about what you're reading and resources, because when you move to your capstone project or your dissertation or your thesis, you'll have a ready source of information. And start gathering things around your clinical love. If you are an OB nurse or a psych nurse or a med-surg, begin that literature pulling so that you can stay current on what's out there in the research literature. And keep it organized so that you can readily access it. When you are writing your literature review, they encourage you to write objectively, and that is using present tense, active voice. And you're going to find table 7.1 on page 127 is really great in helping you word the kinds of reporting mechanisms for the review of the literature. And certainly the more you do it, the easier it gets. So start that now. All right, moving on to Chapter 8 in Theory. It is nailing Jello to a tree time. I'm kidding. Theory is fabulous, and it really offers us an opportunity and a theoretical base to hang research on. So these are just some terms I want you to reflect upon. The high-quality studies always include a theoretical or conceptual framework integration because it should serve as a framework for the whole study. And it's what you hang your research on, and it's reflected in every phase and step of the research process. So just kind of look at these terms and understand them. There are conceptual models that you are going to encounter because while there are a lot of specifics to research, there are also some abstract things that we have to attend to. And just remember that theory is an integrated set of defined concepts that help us view phenomenon and that can be used to describe, explain, predict, and control that phenomenon. And these models really serve as a visual picture, a broad explanation of those phenomena. And if you look at page 134 in your textbook, you're going to see an example of Pinder's model. And you're going to see that a lot in nursing research. So that may help to make it clearer of what a model would look like. Now the frameworks are conceptual underpinnings. And these are usually based on one such existing theory, like your theoretical framework is based on a theory, like Carl Rogers' theory of learning. And let's say we're looking at students contracting for a grade that may increase motivation in a course. And also their self-directed learning. Well, everything in the study then would go back to the concepts of Carl Rogers' theory. Does that make sense? I hope so. Now, a conceptual framework is based on a conceptual model, and they may actually be derived from several theories, and they may explain the relationships between concepts. So know these terms, theoretical framework and conceptual framework, and look for them in your studies because they should be there. Now, nursing has some models very specific to us and what we do. And you're going to see those central themes there that we always reflect on human beings and environment and health and nursing. And particularly, we utilize that deductive and inductive reasoning in the application of these concepts to nursing. So it is important for research studies because they help to support and evaluate the theory empirically or scientifically. Very, very cool. Now here are some models, again, that are specific to nursing. Now, Pinder's health promotion model, I really love this one. It was developed originally in 1982 and revised in 2006. But it really helps to identify individual characteristics, and it explains and explores that it explains the influence of behavior on cognition and affect to produce behavior. So it really is a behavioral model of why certain individuals seek health promotion and others may not. So it helps to explore those relationships. So you may see Pinder's noted a great deal in all kinds of educational and client-based research. So conceptual and theoretical frameworks are essential. look for them because they do help the research in terms of supporting and explaining, predicting, controlling the conceptual models of phenomena. Here are some other models that are often used by nurse researcher, and you may see these in the articles that you're reading. And I encourage you to spend a little time in your text regarding these. Now there are some particular to qualitative research, like the symbolic interactionism. Those you're only going to find in some grounded theory. And some other regarding cultural theories and the phenomenological philosophy of human experiences. So look at these in your textbook. Really the only things I'm concerned about you understanding are theories, theoretical framework, conceptual framework, concepts, and constructs. Focus on those as you were reading and reflecting on this lecture, so that you will understand and be able to seek these as you pursue research. It's a joy to be with you, and I'll see you soon.